Let's get to the exciting part. Once I've taken my pattern and after testing its fit, I can make it into other styles. Basically, once you have established a basic pattern, you can make it into all sorts of different style garments. This is where it gets real fun. I found this purple jersey in a local fabric store and it was just enough to make it into a top and a beach dress. In the last part of this little series, I will show you how I modified the pattern. This is just one of many versions you could create. Whenever you have an idea, you can just pull out the pattern and modify it. That is what I mean when I refer to a block pattern archive. Modifying patterns is easy. Again, there's just a few things to know and a few tools to have in your skill set to redesign your wardrobe in infinite ways. One of the ways is to simply shorten or lengthen, or to add or subtract width. In the transformation of this top to become a dress, I lengthened it, and I added overall width to it using a method we refer to in pattern making as slash and spread. This is the pattern of my top. I make a safety copy before I'm modifying my pattern. I already marked vertical lines on the pattern, and that is where I want to cut it to spread the surface open to add width. Since my pattern already has seam allowances, I will take them off. I'm doing this to use the pattern as I would use a base block pattern, and block patterns generally don't have seam allowances. To start, I'm cutting myself a piece of paper that is the length that I want my dress to be. I am using the base pattern of my top. It doesn't matter which side of the pattern I begin with. I'm using the straight edge of my paper as either center front or back. In my case, it will be the center back. I also marked the horizontal circumference lines on my pattern. This is the underarm circumference line and the waistline. This helps me to align the pattern on the paper, and it will also be the area where you can measure the width later if you want to quickly assess the size. Since I'm wearing the top I made, it's easy to measure down the center back to determine where I want it to end. I measured 45 inches and I marked that point at the lower end of my center back line. Now I look at my vertical lines and I can trace the upper part of my pattern right up to the point where my first vertical line runs into the armhole. After I have made sure that I have traced the upper part to my first slice line point, I can cut or slash open the paper along the vertical lines. I realign my pattern on the paper and place my weight so that it doesn't move. Now I can basically add as much width as I want by opening the pattern sideways. I am deciding on a width in the bottom hem of my dress and preliminarily mark an outside seam endpoint. I now estimate where my side seam will be to know how I have to trace the rest of my armhole. Then I spread my pattern so that I have a good distribution of width in both cuts. I can trace the rest of the armhole now and also the side seam. I like the slight waist curve and I'm keeping it. At a certain point, going from the waist to the hem, I'm drawing my side seam straight to meet the hem. To draw out the hem, I'm squaring my first few centimeters of the hemline off of the center back. I also like the idea of having an angle in the transition to the front at the side seam. Usually, we take care that transitions are straight, but you can plan different ones. To plan an angular transition as a deliberate choice is different. This will add a neat little feature to my dress, and if it's deliberate, it's a feature and not a mistake. So again, designer's choice. Now I can cut my back piece, and when I reach my armhole, you can see how the end of the side seam moved up a little bit. This is because I turned the pattern around the two pivot points in the armhole, so don't be concerned if that happens. This is wanted, and when the two pieces are sewn together, the side seam will move down again and push the added width towards the front and back again. This is the magic of the pattern grid and how you can use the mechanics to lead the width to wherever you want it. The front. Since I planned the front and back hemlines to be identical, I can trace the bottom hemline and beginning of the side seam up towards the armhole. I'm also copying the horizontal lines, the underarm circumference line, and the waistline. This is where I'm matching my front piece. I marked only one vertical line on the front, approximately where the breast is. I also cut sideways along the underarm circumference line into the armhole and neckline to not affect the width of the strap. Now I can align the center front with the horizontal lines that I copied from my back pattern. I'm tracing the neckline and the strap up to the point where I want to spread my pattern and to add the width. Now, I want to match my front and back side seams, and to do that, I can take my back pattern again and transfer the width of the back at the waist to my front. I will use this mark to know how far to spread my front pattern. I already draw the side seam from the waist down, and my lower pattern is set and done. Now I know where I can align my front piece to draw the rest of the armhole and upper side seam. To make sure the side seam is correct, I can pull my back pattern piece again and make sure it's the same length all into the underarm. I now check the transition under the arm and fine-tune the transition in that area. I also check the transition at the shoulder again and do the subtle adjustments. Now I go back to the hemline and see if I like the transition of the two pieces in the side seam. I deliberately choose to have an angle here, and I can now see that it's not strong enough. I am exaggerating it even more to take it to an extreme angle. I'm cutting the front hemline and the new angle and all around the front pattern piece. The two pieces are now cut, and I can use the circumference lines as guides to match up my front and back piece. In the final pattern, I will cut notches at the waistline. The only thing I have to do now is to adjust the angle in the back hemline. Therefore, I'm aligning the front on the back at the waistline and transfer the changes I did to the front hem to the back. I cut it off and the dress pattern is finished. You need to add seam allowances and to mark the grain line, which in this case is the center front and the center back. Since I'm using the same fabric for the dress that I use for the top, I can also copy the notches in the armhole and neck because I already know that those work easy. In the next part of this video, I will show you a fun way where I use the tendency of jersey to roll up to my advantage. I cut myself a band that is roughly 2 inches wide. I will cut it back later, and I cut it so wide because it's easier to handle. This fabric rolls a lot. I want to stitch it into the back of the hem so that both layers roll up. This gives me a fun double roll at the end, which looks great and also gives the hem a little bit more weight. I'm spreading the hem and the trim out on my ironing board, top side facing down to apply some starch again. This helps to avoid the curling for now and makes the stitching so much easier. I let that dry a little bit before giving both the band and the hem a good press with the iron. Once that is done, I want to place the band under the hemline. To do that, I am turning my dress inside out. You want to make sure that the hem lies perfectly relaxed on your surface. I am aligning the band with flush cut edge at the bottom. In jerseys, the edges roll up towards the top side of the fabric. Since I want both layers to roll up, I'm placing the front side of my band facing down on the back side of my hem and simply align it with the flush cut edge, following the curve. There will be some wrinkles again since I'm forcing a straight band into a curve. Here I can use the iron with steam again to carefully press them down. I'm using pins to hold the band in position while I align the rest of the distance of the hem to the side seam. At the angle in the side seam, the band will meet at an angle too. Here I'm just making sure that my band covers the seam allowance and I simply cut off any excess fabric at the edge. Jersey doesn't really fray out much, and since the band is in the back, the transition here will not be visible anyway. I'm taking good care to press the band flat and to follow the curve to the other side seam. When I reach the other side, I make sure to lead the band over the seam allowance again and cut it behind it in an angle following the side seam. They should overlap for about 3/8 of an inch. I like to place another pin at the top corner, the stitching of the hemline. This is the top and this is the underside. As the last step, I want to stitch along the edge of my hem at 3/4 of an inch using my marks on the side of my sewing foot. I start at one side and make sure that I'm catching all the overlapping layers in the bottom. I stitch all around the hemline following the distance mark. When I reach the other angular transition in the other side seam, I'm checking again if all layers are still lying perfectly flat under my hem. Turning the needle in the angle is a little challenging. I have to take the needle out to turn my direction. This is a bit tricky and can distort the stitch, so you want to wiggle it a little bit and avoid too much tension on your needles. They can break. Once I feel like I'm good to stitch the other side, I follow the hemline again until I reach the beginning of my hem stitching where I started. Done! Now we have these 2 layers of fabric at the hem that will curl up after washing. In the back, there's quite a bit of excess fabric that I left earlier to make it easier to stitch. I can now trim that back. I start at the side seam and cut the excess to about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. I'm also giving my hem a good press from the outside to flatten out the stitching. Now I just have to wash out my starch, and I simply do that in the washing machine. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and maybe I could inspire you to try it out for yourself. There's no better way to learn patterning than by just doing it. I see you in the next one, where I will do it all over again.